As you will know, if you've signed up to be here, our guest this evening is Julian Hoffman, who is a wonderful writer who lives in the Prespa region. And before we get into that, I'll just let you know a little bit about Walk, Listen, Create. I have a feeling that most of the people who are here have actually signed up and are subscribers to Walk, Listen, Create, but there's some new faces as well, and some people who've just come for this evening's talk. Walk, Listen, Create, if you don't know, we're a not-for-profit organization, and we support artists, composers, performers, sound designers, and writers who create work on foot or about walking. And these salons are about as much about as finding out our guests' approach to writing about walking as they are about the walking that they may be writing about. And the format will be that this is a salon, so I'll be having a sort of discussion with Julian for about half an hour. And then I'm going to open it up to questions. So anyone who has a question that they want to ask, they can either pop it in the chat. I'm going to open my chat so I can see that. Or just put your hand up. I can see you, and I will hand over to you. Okay, so Julian Hoffman, if you don't know already, moved to the Prespa Lakes region in the mountainous area of northern Greece in 2000. It's a quarter of a century ago now.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, his book, Irreplaceable, The Fight to Save Our Wild Places, was a finalist in the Wainwright Prize for writing on global conservation in 2020, and a Royal Geographical Society Book of the Year. Much of his work explores the relationship between humans and the natural world, alongside the cultures and communities of those places, and is a blend of nature, travel, history, and landscape writing. I hope you find that an appropriate description.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Great. His most recent book, Lifelines, which you can see behind me, and actually I'll do that thing that they do. Here it is. It's wonderful. Hardback, and I think it's out in paperback now, isn't it?
No, not yet.
No, okay. I
In
think
paperback,
you
yes.
posted a picture of it, but
Yeah,
okay. So, but if you want a nice hardy
yeah.
thing, you can take it out into the field. It will be out in paperback soon. Searching for a Home in the Mountains of Greece. It was published in May this year, and it focuses on the Prespa region, which some of you who are here will know very well, and I think I saw you in Prespa. Okay. So let's start with some questions. Now, Julia, now it's in the midst of time, and I can't remember if you said this when I was chatting to you in Prespa, or if I read it in your book, or if it was in another interview because I saw you speak at our books. But you said
Mhm.
that when you first moved to Greece, and it was a bit on a whim. You can talk a bit about that. If not a whim, not a whim. It was
Not exactly a whim.
not a whim.
No, no.
No, but it was quite sudden. You decided to move
Yeah,
there. You hadn't, you sort of packed up your bags and you left. You didn't have a place to move
yeah.
to. But when you got there, you didn't speak Greek, and you said that walking was one of the first ways you got to know the
Yeah,
area.
yeah.
And also, I guess maybe communicate with it was possibly the way
Yes.
that you described it. Do
Yeah.
you want to talk about that a little?
Of course. First, just before I begin, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Walk, Listen, Create for hosting tonight, to you, Anne-Marie, for all the wonderful work you put into this, and to everybody who's come along. Many of you, because I can see a few faces and names, who I, of course, met here in Prespa during the various walking workshops and the that have happened every couple of years for several years now. And a special thanks to those who got up at a very, very early hour in Australia to tune in because we've spanned the globe, it seems. Yes, walking. I mean, for those who don't know, my wife Julie and I, we arrived in this incredible part of the world, these two ancient lakes entirely encircled by a bowl of mountains at the crossroads of three countries, Greece, Albania, and North Macedonia. And we'd arrived here on the basis of a book. We'd read a book that described this landscape, the cultures, the communities, the mountains, the lakes. And we decided that we wanted to try and see if we could put roots down there. And so we arrived here, as you said, a bit on a whim, but we'd carried these great groaning rucksacks, arriving in this village that we'd chosen from that book because one of the photos was so evocative of this mountain landscape that we thought that's the village that we'd like to try and live in. But neither of us spoke Greek. We'd spent several weeks at a night class at the City Lit in London, attempting to learn this very, very difficult language, thinking, wow, we're doing really well, along with all of our fellow students in this class, learning the alphabet. But of course, when you actually arrive in a place like this, you suddenly realize that the minimal amount of language that you've learned isn't really the language at all. And so that was a whole other process that we began. But in the meantime, as we began getting to know and to learn and to love this place that is still our home a quarter of a century later, it was through walking. Walking was our first way in. It was a kind of literacy with land, I suppose. Not that that means we could understand everything about the land, but we would encounter bear tracks on our walks, which spoke of other animals moving, walking through this shared landscape. We would find abandoned houses that spoke of the civil war that had created an extraordinary exodus in this part of Greece. So there was these layers in the landscape that were open to us through the act of walking, through the act of taking note. And I suppose that walking alongside listening, and I often think that they are comparable practices, walking and listening, because at the heart of each for me is really the practice of paying attention. And it was those two things, walking and listening, both to people, but to the stories of the land, because there are languages already out there when we're attuned to them. They were our first real way into trying to understand what this very, very complex crossroads was really all about.
Great. And actually, in the book, you have this very interesting description of the floods that happened in Germany. Not
Yeah,
that you were maybe
yeah,
watching them on the news,
yeah,
and that there was a moment where, I mean, it's huge devastation. I think like 200 people died in these floods in 2021, and Angela Merkel appeared
hmm,
at one of the flood zones,
yeah,
and she said that she didn't think the German language was adequate to describe the devastation. And I
yeah.
thought that was a really interesting comment. And I wondered if that made you think of the way in which, in some ways, language can't tell us everything we need to know about the landscape. And that if walking is a sort of way of communicating with and understanding the landscape.
Yes, I mean it's a really interesting idea. Um, Please don't let my editor know that I've said this, but there are many things beyond language. You know, obviously I earn my living as a writer, but I'm the first to point out that there is a lot that is simply beyond language. There's a wonderful line by the great American writer Annie Dillard where she says, our lives are just faint tracings on the surface of mystery. And I still really believe that in many ways. There are things out in that world, whether it's the way wind moves through aspen trees in the autumn, for example, sounds that are really, really, really difficult, for example, for us to try and communicate to others. We can hold them for a moment, but they're really, really difficult to put down on paper. And what Angela Merkel was trying to come to terms with was what the climate crisis meant to places, to communities, to landscapes that we love, and the horrific loss of life. And that our human language is unprecedented, sorry, is unprepared for the unprecedented nature on the rate of change that climate's bringing to you. So for me, what walking does offer the possibility is of being in greater relationship with the land itself, but also with the human and the more than human world. But what I would add, I think, is that it's not just about walking, that there are other practices, because I'm really interested in the obverse of walking. And that is just being still and sitting in a place, whether that's on a mountain, whether that's on a city bench, and watching other people move past. As a writer, that's the other side of my practice. And I think that it's again, sometimes we lack that language because we're not really listening close enough. And I think for a very, very long period of time, both as an artist, but also in my engagement with the world around me, I was deeply, deeply fascinated by this search for kind of stillness. But how do you how do you advocate for a sense of stillness when you're in motion? How do we walk and be still at the same time? And like so many things that have fueled my practice as a writer, I suppose, it was the natural world which showed me a way forward. Because there's an incredible, beautiful, and elegant small raptor called the kestrel. And the kestrel is a very, very common small raptor in Europe, and it's been found in other parts of the world. And the kestrel has this extraordinary ability. It's one of the few raptors in the world that has this ability to hover. And it will hover over a patch of ground, waiting for voles or mice or whatever it else is looking for. And so what you'll see above railway sidings at the edge of meadows is this incredible, fast, rapid movement of wings. But film studies have shown us that a kestrel's eyes move less than 6 millimeters in any direction while it hovers. So it immediately compensates for the movement of wind by a lift of its tail or a shift of its wing. So amidst that wild beating of wings, the kestrel is essentially still. And that was what I realized. It took me a long time to get there, but increasingly what I'm interested in both walking but also listening is that ability to find stillness within motion, to be on move. And all of us move, both as a practice, but of course we move from place to place. But there's still a possibility, I think, of locating that stillness, that point of focus. And I think that's the real key to recognizing that beyond language, there's something else that can put us in tune with that world around us.
That's really interesting. In fact, when I was thinking about what you were saying, then it made me think also of the and the the limits of language. There's a book by an Australian writer called David Malouf called An Imaginary
Hmm.
Life, and
Yeah.
about Ovid being you've read it. Ovid, the poet, is exiled from Rome to a place, I think it's called Tomis, it's on the Black Sea,
Hmm.
and the people there don't speak his language. And
Yeah.
Latin is useless to him. And
Yes.
then he begins to understand that the language of the people around him is very much about herding and
Hmm.
hunting, very pragmatic things. And he starts to sort of unlearn his language. And then
Yeah.
eventually there's this sort of feral child that appears
Yeah.
that doesn't speak language at all. And he follows the child into the sort of wilds to sort of
Yeah.
to learn the landscape, to learn to speak the
Hmm.
landscape. Like you said, the rustling of the leaves
Yeah.
and how the kestrel hovers. And that's his, and that actually sort of leads me into the next question, which when I was thinking about the pastoralists and the people with their animals
Yes.
and all of that,
Yeah.
that Prespa has all these, this ancient history of,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I don't know how you can maybe tell it, how far it goes back of what they call transhumans, these
Yeah.
sort of pastoralists who move across
Yeah.
land with their animals, sort of herding them across mountains and
Yeah.
spaces, and that's another type of history of walking. And I was wondering
Yes.
how you think about that when you go for. I mean, can you see
Yeah.
tracks that have been going for millennia, that sort of thing?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that fascinated me so intensely when we moved here was to recognize how walking was already embedded in this landscape to such an extent that it was a practice based on seasonal routines. And it was, the Sarakatsani, for example, one of the pastoralist peoples who there's still a few around, but they don't move on foot really anymore. But for centuries and centuries and centuries, they herded all of their cattle and their sheep and their goats on foot from central and lowland southern Greece each spring, all the way up to the mountains that are just outside my house right now in spring. And come autumn, they would make the return journey on foot. And so these routes, and of course, they would often utilize old evocative stone arch bridges, which are now you find them in parts of the landscape where you would think, why was that ever here? But of course, it spoke to a much older tradition of walking in the landscape prior to implementation of a large road network, where these places that might seem odd to our modern eyes were in fact huge thoroughfares for the movement of animals, for the movement of people, this seasonal return, this exchange of goods. And of course, those bridges, they're still dotted all over this country. They're rarely in use anymore. But it was really about locating in the landscape this whole node, this whole network, I suppose, of movement. But what fascinated me the most about the Sarkit Sani, and it was really early on in our stay because I'd stayed one day with the Sarkit Sani high up in the mountains, and they would build these beehive-shaped seasonal homes from reeds that they'd cut at the lake and hauled up into the mountains. And it was the very, very first time that I'd recognized that movement can be home, that rootlessness, as I might have previously identified it as, was nothing of the sort because the entire mountain was their hearth and home. And they'd invited me for tsipro, they'd invited me for cigarettes, they'd laid out this great breakfast of their own homemade cheese on this little wooden table outside a beehive home made of reeds. And it was at that moment that I finally sort of understood that for them, both directions in their walking took them home. And that's not something I'd ever really thought of because we often construct the idea of home as going back home. You think of Odysseus way back, Homer's great archetypal figure. That whole book is all based on the idea of returning home. And yet, the practices of transhumance are actually anchored by home at either end. In the north, they were traveling home to their spring pastures, in the spring, sorry, and in the autumn, they were traveling south to their winter homes. So both directions took them closer to home. And that opened up for me an idea that walking, that motion, that movement, much as is for the more than human world, these species like pelicans that I share this landscape with, they make the exact same movements to their summer grounds here on these Balkan lakes, back to the winter grounds elsewhere. And it made me realize that our ideas of home are often prefaced not on relationship as they should be, but actually about a physical space that accommodates us. And so meeting pastoralist people put me into the idea of the capacity we have for making home wherever we are through the act of reaching out and recognizing affinities within reach of us.
Wow, that's fascinating. I didn't realize they were still operating these communities with
Yes,
such
not
an
so
intensity.
many
Yeah.
anymore, and they ferry their animals by lorry, by truck,
Yeah.
but they were still doing it on foot until the 90s, by and
Wow.
large. Yeah, yeah.
Um, uh, Now, there's another story that I really liked in the book. It was quite interesting. It's sort of, you describe it as a sort of an origin myth of Prespa, and that
Yeah.
the older local people talked about the story that it, obviously predated them and, it went back through the mists of time, where a traveler had arrived from the north in the Prespa region and he was in the local village and people were talking
Hmm.
about being a bit poor and he was
Yep.
saying, well, how can you be poor and why is it that you've got that incredible big field out there and you haven't
Yes.
cultivated it?
Yeah.
And they were like, what are you talking about? We don't have a
Yeah.
giant field that's uncultivated. And he said, I've just walked across it to get here. And they were like, no, that's the lake,
It's
because it
frozen.
was winter and everything was covered with snow and the,
Yeah.
the lake was obviously frozen. And I thought
Yeah.
that was fascinating because you mentioned that the lake rarely, if ever, freezes
Mm.
over now. Maybe it's Little Prespa that occasionally
Yes,
freezes.
it's the smaller of the two
Yeah.
lakes.
So
Yeah.
that story was like
Yeah.
carrying a history of climate change with it.
Absolutely.
And I
Yeah.
wondered if there were
Absolutely.
other stories like that, or whether you
Yeah.
feel that you're telling stories that will be for future generations, that will be stories of climate change.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I've without really setting out to do this, I've ended up kind of becoming a chronicler of climate change here simply because of the time I've spent here and the stories I've written about it. But I've only recently just finished reading Edward Lear's incredible account of a journey through Albania and Greece in 1848. For those who don't know, Edward Lear was he's best known really as a sort of writer of nonsense rhymes in England, but he was also an exquisite watercolorist and an inveterate traveler who spent a lot of time in Israel and the Middle East and in Egypt and Italy and Greece and Albania. And I was reading this book quite recently, and Edward Lear travels on foot and by horse all the way from Thessaloniki all the way to the coast of Albania and then sort of back. But he crosses along the northern edge of Great Prespa Lake, just above where I'm speaking to you right now, in 1848, in September. And because he arranged his book as a diary, from the moment he starts rising up off the plain of Thessaloniki into the mountains, he begins recording by day the extraordinary mountain scenes that he sees. September 14th, the snow-covered mountains. September 15th, the snow-glistening alpine hills. September 16th, snow across these great ridges. September is just a hot summer day for us these days. There's no such thing as snow in September. Yet Edward Lear, because he meticulously notated this in diary form, he stopped me in my tracks because here he was writing about the exact same mountains that I live with him, and they were mantled in snow. So yes, these stories, and I think it's really important, when we're talking about climate change, and what's interesting about Edward Lear is that he walked through a lot of these places, sometimes on foot, sometimes on horse, but often on foot as well. And then I think that it's really important to share these stories, particularly of places that are less written about. And I think that's the key for me in terms of the climate crisis. There's a great writer from the Pacific island of Guam called Julian Guam, and he says we don't need more facts about what climate change is doing because we know those. What we need are more stories from the places that we love, from the places we hold dear, from the places we might stand to lose. And so I realized that my walking around the Prespa Basin these days, in a way, is about trying to record and elevate some of these stories that many people might say, well, they come from the margins, they come from the peripheries. But in my opinion, there's no such thing as a margin or a periphery. You can be marginalized economically, politically, for all kinds of reasons, but your place, your home place, is always going to be the center of your world. And so that's what I'm trying to do, I suppose, in this work, to elevate the stories of Prespa and these communities who are still hanging on here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's very true about the sort of, for various reasons, unfortunately, facts have have fallen
Yes.
out of favor. But
Yeah.
aside from that, they don't really communicate to most people
Yeah.
those sorts of things in a way that a story about snowy mountains,
Yes.
like, oh, it
Yeah.
was snow here in September. I
Yeah.
mean, that's a really interesting thing. I mean, I was fascinated. I mean, I didn't know so much about it, but I just read in passing that Edward Lear had been in Prespa. And I was like, oh, the only, I mean, I'm a fan of The Owl and the Pussycat. I think that's one of my favorite poems. So
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
doesn't
Yeah.
really tell me a lot about the climate,
Yeah.
but yes, it was
No. No.
fascinating to hear that. Um, so also, I wanted to move on into another idea of walking, and it might be something you've had, personal experience of. I mean, this region, because of being on this sort of border region, it's had a whole very a dark and complicated history of civil war and exodus and immigration on
Yeah.
foot. And I was wondering how these stories were often stories of survival, sometimes
Yeah.
just stories of displacement or people looking for a better life. But how does that shape your experience of walking around? Maybe philosophically, but maybe also you've had encounters as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good point that because it's easy sometimes, sorry, to think only of the way we walk or people we are close to might walk as part of a community. But of course, the world's landscapes are layered with the walk-ins and of all of us. The great historian Noel Malcolm once said that if you go back far enough, you'll find out that we all came from somewhere else. And walking has always been part of the human condition, of course. And some of us walk for pleasure, some as a sort of artistic practice, some for exercise, but some often out of necessity. And so living at this incredible crossroads, as you rightly point out, where there are three countries that have often undergone some extraordinarily difficult periods historically, I recognize that I'm quite privileged to be able to move freely through this landscape. You know, at the end of the Second World War, when the Greek Civil War erupted and killed an enormous number of people, the Prespa region was almost a coda to that incredibly damaging episode in Greek history. And a lot of people fled, civilians, refugees, soldiers of the left who were losing the battle, and they all fled on foot. They went out into the mountains of Albania. They tried to go out into the mountains of Yugoslavia, which had been closed, the border by Tito. So these were walks of desperation. Um, and similarly, when we moved here, it wasn't long after Albania had effectively collapsed as a working state in the late 1990s because of a wild pyramid scheme that had just totally fallen apart. And so the country was just absolutely broken. And I would often meet in the mountains very desperate Albanian families crossing the mountains on these paths. And one image that I'll always remember is finding back then, often on these remote mountain paths, the side of the earthen track littered with huge discs of sunflower heads that these people on the move would take from their gardens and then eat the seeds as they walked. And once they'd depleted all the sunflower seeds from any great head, any particular head, they would discard it. And so you would see these empty rows of great, these great discs that had once been full of sunflower seeds. And when I was then on the Albanian side of the border, sometimes you would see paths there rising up the mountains, and often people simply carrying like a small plastic bag with some water and a loaf of bread. And that was it. So walking, I'm fully aware that the walks I undertake are just one within a huge assembly, let's say, of walks that have layered this landscape with the many meanings that it holds and carries and sustains to this day. And I think that part of my practice, in a sense, is to honor those other people whose steps, their footfalls, have carried them here out of need, out of necessity, out of escaping danger, whatever it might be. And so I try to be aware of those as much as I can. In the same way that the brown bears that are my near neighbors here, and I do very much consider them my neighbors, they're fellow citizens of Prespa. They occasionally come into my garden and I follow their tracks. And the tracks of brown bears, we know now through genetic testing, they often cross these borders as well. So a bear that I'd gathered scat of a few years ago that was then genetically tested, it was then discovered it had crossed into Albania a few months later, and then a few months after that, it had crossed the border into North Macedonia. So we're back to this idea of movement and motion and what makes ultimately our whole planet tick. And encapsulated in those stories are sometimes things we can't really understand. I can't really understand exactly what it means to be an Albanian on the move back in the late 90s, fearful of what might happen. But I also remember several years ago finding two distinct sets of tracks of brown bears on the shores of the lake. And brown bears outside the mating season are very rarely together, adults, a male and a female. But here were two walking along the shore, and I followed them and I followed them. And then for whatever reason, both of these bears, because their tracks told a story, they both turned side by side at the edge of the water and looked out over the lake. Was there a boat? Was there a sound? Was there a bird? Was there light somewhere? I have no idea. But we go back to that idea of mystery and what the paths, the prints, the sort of impressions in the earth itself tell us. We can't always know, but there's this extraordinary wonder about them as well. And then that pair of bears returned to their path and carried on. And of course, those are signs, because you asked earlier about language and literacy within a space, but those are signs that are very ephemeral. The passage of bears, those tracks will be washed away by wind and waves within days, if not hours. And so I think it's really important as artists, at least, to try and capture those moments, to take note of them and record them because they're there for barely any time at all. But I think they tell important stories of how ultimately we live within a shared world, and that all these stories are not just parallel, but they're entwined and we're nested within them all.
I like to think, since those bears are rarely together, that they were going for a walk to look at the sunset together. That's my
Absolutely. And
romantic imagination.
I'm willing to support you 100% on that interpretation.
Now we're getting close to the end of the time when we normally talk before we hand it over to questions to the audience. So I might just zoom ahead. I just wanted to know if you could tell me a little bit about your writing process. I mean, when you have your daily walks and your daily practice, I mean, you might be working on a book at that particular time, but
Yeah.
do you like take notes, keep a diary about that, which you then later kind of mine for your books? How does that work for you?
Yeah, I'm an inveterate note taker, mostly because I realized that once you reach middle age, your memory's not as good anymore, and those small, those fine, those subtle details, they're blown away easily by any shift in the wind, and so it's important to sort of, for me at least, to get those down on paper quite quickly. Um, but my walking is a real big part of that, and my walking over many decades now has evolved quite a lot. I used to I love the thrill of going for very long walks on my own across wild mountains, whatever it might be. But I've realized over time that that doesn't interest me as much as it used to. I still love walking throughout the basin, but my daily walk is so rewarding. And it's so rewarding in a sense because it's a shortish circular route that I follow behind the house, up through the valley, around the edge of the mountains, and back home. And what makes it so rewarding for me on a personal level is because it's the same walk more or less every day. I'm present for all of these extraordinary other passages, the changes already in motion within the land itself, the bursting of leaf buds in spring, the bears that might be near the house, the otter that might quickly press up the river, all of these different things. And so, what I'm more and more increasingly interested in is attuning myself to the changes that are happening around me rather than moving through a much longer journey, let's say. I mean, I still love getting out in the mountains and those walks, but the real richness for me comes on observing those much closer details and how they change from day to day.
And I would just actually, I'm just interested whether you kind of built up, a lexicon. I'm imagining you did because you were also observing birds and doing a lot
Yeah.
of work. I mean, one of the things I noticed when I moved to England from Australia was that I just didn't have the words for all the different plants and all
Yes.
the
Yeah.
birds and that. So
Yeah.
did you build up your own personal lexicon of things that you saw and make it like you see a new bird or a new plant or something and go, I have to find out what that's called and write it down?
Yeah. I mean, there's just as walking brings us, into greater sense of relationship, so do those encounters out in the landscape itself. And there's the great Scottish writer Nan Shepherd who wrote a fabulous book, I think in the 60s, called The Living Mountain. Don't quote me on the date, I might be around a bit wrong, but it's called The Living Mountain. And there's an amazing sentence in that. She says, "The thing to be known grows with the knowing."
Mm.
And as soon as I might see something new, whether that's a flower, a bird, whatever it might be, by being able to slowly put a name to it, it opens up a whole other set of stories about the lifeways, the lifelines, the passage that that species has been on through its own evolutionary history and story. And that really fascinates me. You take, for example, a bird like the Arctic tern, it undertakes, and takes us back to the idea of motion. The Arctic tern undertakes the largest migratory journey of any species on the planet because it moves all the way from the Antarctic to the Arctic and then all the way back. So it basically lives in the light of a perpetual summer. Um, but I would have no knowledge of that extraordinary capacity, that extraordinary lifeline, if I didn't know the name of that species. Otherwise, I could see that bird and say, well, that's a really elegant, beautiful bird, the way it sighs the air with those white wings. But knowing its name, like we do with a family member, a lover, whoever it might be, is means that I can deepen that relationship. And that's a really, really extraordinary thing once you start understanding how complex these other lives, just as it is with all the lives of the human communities that surround us as well. The more than human world holds those an immensity of richness.
Okay, well, I might hand it over to the audience now. Does anyone want to ask a question? Yes, Fred.
Hi, wonderful. You have an intimate relationship with the land, and I've had the chance to be there in July this year, and I loved so much oriole birds, you know, these yellow birds, and I was impressed by this huge population and the richness of the biodiversity. And
Hmm.
my question is, if you have connections with ecologists, if you collaborate with ecologists, if you share your data and your experience with them, and what's going on here, really, in terms of the conservation of the biodiversity?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. I have very, 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 very close relationship with the ecologists of the area. My wife Julia actually works for the local environmental organization, which is called the Society for the Protection of Prespa, and they were founded in 1991, if I remember correctly. And they have had an enormous impact here in terms of maybe we could find their website link actually, we could put that in, or I could in a minute, in the chat box. They were founded, first of all, to protect the incredibly rare pelican colonies that we have here on the Prespa Lakes, but also the biodiversity in general. So they've been doing remarkable work for, well over 3 decades now. And some of that work is being challenged right now because of the impact of climate change. These two ancient lakes, which are believed to be somewhere in the region of 3 to 5 million years old, are now receding very, very quickly. Um, in the last 30 to 40 years, the big lake has dropped by as much as 10 meters. And according to NASA, it has lost more than half of its volume. So we are at quite a precarious point in Prespa's history. Uh, and that loss of water has been determined by hydrologists to be primarily caused by the lack of rain and snow because of climate change. So even in our early years here, we used to have incredible snowfalls that we just don't get anymore. So the Mediterranean, Greece, as many of you will know, is really right on the front line of the climate crisis in terms of how it's impacting biodiversity. Uh, but one of the stories I do tell in the book towards the end is how there is an extraordinary, unique, and very, very important forest that has grown up now in the last 30 to 40 years, ever since the lake was receding. And there's no forest like this anywhere else in Greece. And so, as the water is leaving, in its place is this remarkable forest that's now home to a huge number of brown bears, wolves, jackals, badgers, all kinds of species. And I'm not trying to suggest that climate change that means climate change is good, but rather I think the important story here is that there's a story of adaptability. When a lake is leaving, it's important to learn how to become a forest because we already have a sense right here that the stories we used to tell about our world are no longer suitable for the shape we have made it. And so we need to learn a form of resilience and adaptability that forest, that brand new forest, on the shores of Great Prespa Lake is already showing us in real time. So whenever you're next here, I would be very happy to take you there and show you what is happening, in response, what nature is doing in response to the dropping of lake levels.
Hi, Julian. It's been
Hello,
quite a
Jazz.
time,
Very nice
eh?
to
How you
see you.
doing?
I'm good. You?
Yeah, fine. I don't know if you can remember when we were chatting at the Kendall Mountain Festival all those years ago when we either had heads of hair or we weren't so grey and grizzled. Um, I'm interested in, 'cause you mentioned this sort of daily. I may have got it wrong. Does it? Are you informed, or do you attend to, because of that, your discipline of writing?
Could you just repeat I lost the sound for a moment, just
Yeah,
the
sure.
last part
So
of it.
yeah. So your your daily discipline of walking,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I guess it must inform, but does it attend to the discipline of writing? Are you relate? Is it related to that, or do
Yes,
you just
yes.
go, yeah, okay?
Yeah,
And how
very
do you
much
manage
so.
that?
I mean, my daily walk isn't very long.
Yeah, sure.
I'm a full-time writer. I'm at my desk most of the day.
Okay.
But, and I'm by far from being the first writer to tell you what I'm about to tell you. But getting out for that walk isn't just about being in greater relationship. It's not just about seeing what else is going on. It's also an incredible way for me to generate ideas. There's sometimes a
Okay.
clarity that can
Mm-hmm.
come from walking. The new book that I'm working on now literally was staring me in the face for many years, but I hadn't seen it until I took about 2 years ago one of my regular short walks, and I stopped on the track,
Okay.
and just something about the movement that day, something about the way my body was moving in response to the light, to the weather, whatever it was, and I stopped on the track that I've walked thousands of times. And I just thought, oh
Mm.
my God, that's the next book. It's been there. But it took sometimes that freeing. I think what I love about that my short walk at least is that I find it very freeing. I can put the desk away, but in many ways, what happens is the desk then comes back to me. But I've managed to alter my sort of brain patterns and freed up some
Mhm.
space that allows different ideas to sort of come in, or at least a clarity to emerge when there's often a lot of blurriness at my desk.
So do you trust that will happen because it's
Um,
such a practice now, or are you still amazed at what happens?
I'm still often amazed because it doesn't
Okay.
always happen. And I
Yeah.
think that's the beauty of it. It might happen, and it's
Hmm.
happened quite often. And I know
Hmm.
that it's a good way to put me in that frame of mind, but it still doesn't always happen, which
No.
makes it a beautiful surprise when
Yeah.
it does, I would say.
Okay. Well, thank you, and keep
You,
being surprised,
thank you, Jez. All the best.
and you too.
Does anyone else want to ask a question, make a comment? Um, Anne, I notice you, I'm sorry, I'm singling you out there, Anne, but I noticed you nodding a lot when Julian was talking about doing his daily walk and what you learn by doing the same walk all the time. Do you want to ask anything about that or
Well,
comment?
there's just I don't know. I mean,
Hello, Anne.
I also do a daily walk every day, and I was just a lot of it was nodding in agreement. Julian, it's so great to see you, and I was so sad not to be able to see you when I was in Prespa in July.
Yes, I'm so
So I'm
sorry. I
really
was
happy
on
to
my
see you
book
again.
tour.
And
I
there's
was only
so
there for a day or two, unfortunately.
yeah, no, I know it wasn't the timing didn't work,
Yeah.
but they have, but yeah, you've been, since I met you 2 years ago and reading your work, you've been a great influence on me as I'm
Oh,
figuring out
thank you.
this
Thank you
relationship
very
between
much.
walking and writing. And I actually just did a project where I used the Nan Shepherd quote as the title of the project.
Ah, really? It's so
Such
wonderful.
an
It is so
amazing
wonderful.
quote, and a way of approaching, sort of relating to developing a deep relationship with a
Hmm.
place.
Hmm.
Um, I was really, I sort of like there, several things jumped out at me, and they kind of seem, I'm trying to connect the threads. This idea that movement can be home, which to
Hmm.
me is also about the the path also becomes a kind of home too. So I'm curious what you think about that. I mean, you were saying that there's a place and a place, but there's also
Hmm.
the path. So tell
Absolutely.
me a little bit about the path as the home as well. How
Yeah. I
thing.
mean, I think, the path, of course, it's like anything in a sense that once you begin rupturing the link between, I often use comparisons with the natural world. For example, wetlands that are vitally important to the migrating pelicans that nest here in Prespa, but who then depart at the end of the nesting season. The summer wetlands here in Prespa and the winter wetlands wherever else they are, they're only viable if the path that connects them is also intact, that it's
Mm,
not disrupted by
yeah.
whatever it might mean. And so
Mhm.
I think that it's really, really important to honor the path as well, because of course, just as in the natural world, that movement, or if we want to take it back to the movement of people and their animals, the Sarkitsani, as they used to make these epic journeys from southern Greece all the way to the mountains here in the north, it their home might have been here in Prespa in the summer, and their winter home or their winter grounds was home in the further south. But that entire journey was only possible if en route there was viable habitats and grazing
Mm,
lands and landscapes that were suitable both for them and for the nourishment of the herds they were bringing along with them. So I see in many ways, and I think because I'm interested in trying to remove the borders we often place between humans and the more than human world. And so
mhm.
much of my work is really about trying to find those affinities and those connections. And so I see the path that you and I might be on between places as no different than the necessary paths that pelicans require between wetlands, or the Sarkitsani moving between mountain and lowland need those paths to be intact, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
that's wonderful. Yeah, thank you. And as you were talking, I was thinking about one of the problems for humans and modern modes of transportation is that we get used to thinking that there's a point of departure and a destination, and if you're riding in a car or a train, or that everything in
Yes,
between doesn't count in some way,
yes,
and that
absolutely.
walking gets you back to,
Yeah,
that the in between counts. So that was
yes.
the thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, I drive like most people, and
Mhm.
I enjoy being able to drive different places. But what I really love, and I just did it when I came back home to Greece a couple of weeks ago, was being on a bus from Thessaloniki back to Prespa, because it meant that I was much more present in that journey. Not as present as if I was walking, but I wasn't about to walk with my big suitcase coming back from London, all the way from Thessaloniki. But I saw little villages with, because it's winter, there were stork nests. But
Mm.
they were empty because it's winter, and we would stop at a red light, and I thought, wow, so storks will be back there in a few more months' time. And I saw a hen harrier, a wonderful, beautiful, elegant raptor hunting over grasslands. So, that journey, in a way, it was a bit like the journey that Edward Lear took. Not quite as slow as his, but he was often really fascinated with the birds and the landscapes and things that he saw as he was walking and on horseback between Thessaloniki and Prespa, and then on into Albania. And he talked often about the different species of birds he saw, and that in many ways his journey was through. It's literally called a journey through, not a journey to Albania.
Mm.
It's not called a journey from Greece to Albania. It's called a journey through Greece and Albania. And I think that idea of moving through rather than to a place is really important, or at least that distinction can be critically vital to make.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Thank you.
You're very welcome. You're very
Okay,
welcome.
so we have a relatively strict Okay, well, also, I'll just point out that I put a link to the Society for the Protection of
Ah,
Press
yes, well
if
done.
you're interested, and also links to Julian's website and his publisher's website if you want.
Thank you.
And you can buy it you can buy your book directly from the publisher, I believe.
Yeah, or there's links to all the other places. And I should say, because you were right, that is Lifelines in its hardback version, which comes with an incredibly beautiful map of the Prespa region done by a great Greek
Yes,
artist
the
called
beautiful.
Martina Galati.
Yeah.
And we've removed the borders. The three countries are present and named, but we made a decision, the two of us, to remove the borders to increase the sort of fluidity. And for those who might be in the United States, this is the very, very beautiful cover, which will be coming out in hardback in April. And that's actually the Edward Lear's iconic sketch of a Dalmatian pelican that we've managed to get permission to use on the cover of the US edition. So that one's coming out in April, and the paperback in the UK is coming out in June, I believe.
Thank you so much, Julian, for joining us and talking to us about your book and your experiences in Prespa. That was wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. And thank you so much again, Julian. Thank you.
And I'd just like to say thank you to everybody from across the different time regions. It's been a real pleasure and a joy.
Great.
Take care.